Hi folks! Today we're going to talk about using some of the gorgeous cords and braids that we have learnt together on our Viking Age clothing. We're going to look at where they were used, why they were used, and which stitches were used to attach them. Now, it's easy to think of these trims as something purely for decoration. In some examples it is exactly that. However, in others there's a little bit more to it, and today we're going to deep dive into some of the examples that we have. In part one, we're going to look at where they were used. So we're going to look at the position on the garments and how that reflects the intended function of the cord or braid. In part two, we'll look at how different types of cords and braids were attached and how that varied depending on where they were placed on the garment. We'll also look at how the stitching techniques vary so that you can get strong and beautiful stitches attaching any type of cord and braid. This video is just looking at the types of cords and braids that we've learnt together so far. We're not talking about other types of edging like tablet braid or silk trims or separate embroidery pieces, anything like that in this video. However, these techniques can be used in combination with those other techniques. So with that in mind, let's deep dive. Now, there are numerous examples of the use of cords and braids on Viking Age clothing, and they broadly fall into two groups. We've got the structural or functional cords and braids. These are added to protect the edges from wear or to give structure to seams and hems. And then we have the more purely decorative items. What you'll find is that usually they fall into both categories. They serve both functions. What first got me thinking about this subject was the following quote from Jane Culler's blog in the article titled A Deeper Look at Edges. In the article Two Women's Graves with Textiles from Kopang, author Anne Stein-Ingstad stated that she believed that a fragment of cloth from Kopang that had brocaded tablet weaving at one edge and a cord sewn to the outside of that edge was likely the hem of the garment, because the applied cord would take the wear from use and therefore protect the more painstakingly wrought woven trim. This made a lot of sense to me and encouraged me to dig deeper into the ways that cords and braids were used on Viking Age textiles. Anyone who's had a go at completely hand sewing a garment knows the time and effort that it takes to do well. Now imagine hand spinning all the thread and weaving it yourself. In this day and age, we can go to a market, we can buy our cloth off a roll or have it delivered to our door through the marvels of the internet. But even then, we know that good cloth costs money and we want our reenactment kit to last a long time, which is where these techniques can come in really handy. Back in the Viking Age, quality clothing was not just a marker of social status, but was intrinsic to people's survival. So how much more carefully are we going to want to tend it with that in mind? The creation of clothing required a huge investment in time and resources, and they'd use whatever means they had to extend its lifespan. So it seems to me that employing some of these techniques is a really good way to illustrate that, particularly if you are an LHE focused reenactor who's up close with the public and a bit of a textile geek like me. It's also an inexpensive way to make our kit look prettier, especially if tablet braid is either inaccessible to us for financial reasons or just too rich for our kit. Cords and braids are for everybody. Cords and braids appear in finds from all through our period, all over Scandinavia and in the UK. We've got quite a wide breadth of research in that respect. And what we find is that the cords used to make them are extremely fine. They're distinguished by how delicate they are in a lot of cases. You'll find that most of the trims are between 2 and 6 millimetres in width, no more. Quite different to what we consider a trim in the modern era, which is well worth keeping in mind. As far as their placement is concerned, I've identified 5 fairly broad categories that they can slot into. Firstly, we've got edges, either protecting the edges of garments themselves or protecting the more expensive trims. Secondly, we have as a more decorative element covering the hemming stitches so that they don't show on the outside of the garment. This is more often found on linen garments, but you can also use it on wool. Thirdly, they can be used to cover darts and other seams. They can be used as structural elements in hems and necklines. And finally, they can be used to protect raw edges, whether that's a raw edge, for example, on a cloak or blanket, or as part of a turned hem. So let's take these categories one by one and have a look at some of the finds. Cords are most often used along the very edges of garments, at the neckline, cuffs and hems, either singly or in combination with other types of cord, braid or tablet weave. They're usually attached edge to edge. On this example here, a wrapped cord is used on the very edge of a neckline. On this sample here, you can see that the very edge of the braid there is attaching to the very edge of the fabric here, in this case a turned hem. So rather than laying the braid on top of the fabric like this, which is more decorative in nature, it does still provide some protection to this edge, but it's not going to be as functional as using the braid itself as the very edge of the garment. So that's going to take all of the wear from use. Let's look at some of the examples from the historical record of cords and braids along edges. Fragment 19E from the Hedeby settlement is a fine tabby wool believed to be from trousers. It has a double folded hem with a cord attached with whip stitching. Two of the wool caps found at Dublin exhibit cord sewn to the edge. Item DHC33, a hood from Fishamble Street, has a cabled edging cord around 5mm wide, made of 6 strands cabled together, and this is whip stitched onto the edge of a turned hem with 3 stitches per centimetre. Now this is a little piece of cabled cord here on the top of this braid, and that one is around 5 millimetres in diameter. A second hood, DHC30, has an edging cord that is made of 6 Z-spun strands that are S-plied and then plaited. The cord itself is about 3mm in diameter and is sewn on with black wool thread, which is approximately 1 millimetre wide and uses 4 stitches per centimetre. At Copang, Graves C 27997B has a smocker with a tablet woven band sewn to the edge of the fabric, edge to edge again rather than over the top of the fabric edge itself. At the top of the edge of the band there's a firm, evenly twisted wool cord made from twining several S-twisted threads together. It's sewn on with a whip stitch, which is a lovely example of cords being used in combination with tablet weave, where the densely twisted cord serves to protect the more expensive and time-consuming tablet weave. It's worth noting here that what we often see in tablet braid today is made with much chunkier thread than the originals. Some of them can be sort of 5mm thick and around 30 wide, which is far larger than the extant examples, which are often very delicate. You see the use of silk thread and the use of gold wrapped thread as a brocade as well. And these materials were costly in themselves and well worth the extra measures to protect them. If you're making tablet braid yourself, it's worth looking for wool that's between 18.2 and 22.2 gauge. It's hard to come by. Weavers Bazaar, little plug here, have a really lovely 18 gauge worsted spun wool that I've used for tablet braid, and I'm fairly happy with that, although if you can find something finer, even better. Another example of cords used to frame tablet braid comes from Kostrup. This find is part of a pleated smocker that accompanied by a tablet woven band with 2 woolen strings along each side of the band. Now unfortunately, we're not certain as to how the cords, dress and band were all attached together, aside from having a few whip stitches that attached the cord to the loop of the dress. The smockers from Birka give us multiple examples where a cord or braid was added along the top of a hem. Birka fragments 511, 973, 954 and 1084 are woolen smockers which have a wool string along the top. Fragment 1083 is a woolen smocker with a string with no info on what it was made of, unfortunately. And fragment 838 is a woolen smocker with a braided string along the top. Burka 1004 has a wool cord sewn to the edge of a fine dark wool tabby garment. This cord has a triangular cross section, but it's more coarse than other samples at 3 to 4 millimeters. It's sewn to a folded and hemmed edge. The shoulder hem tunic has examples of braids sewn edge to edge around the neckline and around the cuffs. Now, unfortunately, when I was making my version, I didn't actually notice that the picture I was looking at, the fabric I could see just here along the edge there, was the backing fabric that was used to preserve the garment, not actually part of the original itself. It was a rookie mistake there. So when I made my version, I sewed them down on the top of the cuff. I made myself a nice little cuff piece and sewed them on there. However, having since laboriously translated more bits of Lovelyd's thesis via Google Translate, which is an interesting experience considering that they don't have a lot of the specialist terms that are actually necessary, I now know that the braid was in fact sewn to the edge of the band end to end in the same way that the braid around the neckline here was done, rather than sitting on top of the edge of the cuff. In the textiles from Hjolfsnes, which are from slightly after the Viking Age, we see multiple examples of the use of twisted cords and braids on the edges of necklines and hems. The most common braids found are the finger loop style. I'm just showing you here. This fine example is applied to a selvage edge. The second way to use a cord or braid is to cover the stitches from hemming. They can be attached to the surface of the fabric along the row of whip stitches that show on the right side. The shoulder hem tunic demonstrates this technique as it has a line of fine plied cord stitched down over the visible hem stitching around the neckline. These ones are attached using a couching stitch, which we'll talk about more in a moment. If I show you on the other side, this is the seam here, this hemline from when joining the neck piece to the body piece. Bit of an unusual one, the shoulder hem tunic, but it's good for demonstration in this case. There's a line of whip stitches here, and that is covered by this plied cord laid over the top, so you don't see any of the functional stitches on the top side. This example from Burka shows the technique used on linen. Burka 563 is a linen smocker fragment with cord applied over the seam from the hem. Inga Hag suggests that the cord was used to cover the hemming stitches because while stitching on wool was often invisible, the seams show more clearly on linen. As we've just seen with the shoulder hem tunic, you can use it on both. The third option is similar to the last example in that it covers a stitch line. However, this one uses the braid to cover a dart or seam. There's an unusual find from Hedeby Harbour, which has a 6-strand braid used not as an edging, but over the line of an external dart on the front of a smocker. Although we only have a fragment of this garment, it is assumed that the braid would run the full length of the seam. It's a really, really fine braid. It measures just 1 to 2 millimeters wide. If you've seen my video on the 6-strand Hedeby braid, then you've seen that tiny, tiny example. Now, it's a very unique find, but it does give us the option, I think, to talk about using braids over seams and darts. In conjunction with evidence from Mammon, where we have the braid-like embroidery over a seam on a cushion, and on garments like the Lane's cap, which has that dense embroidered stitch covering all the seam lines. I think all these together give us quite nice evidence for the use of fine braids over seams like this, especially for Danish or Anglo-Danish characters. You may also wish to use fine cords inserted into hems to help them retain their shape. A fragment from Dublin, DHC 51, has a cord inserted into a hem. Now this cord is only 2 millimeters wide, but it's incredibly dense. It's Z spun, Z plied, S cabled, and then Z corded. You can see here, this tiny little cord is actually made up of 8 strands. These initial ones are 2-ply. The spin direction on this example isn't exactly correct. If you imagine these individual threads here, plied together, cabled together, and then corded together. So this fine thread here has 8 individual strands that have gone into it, making it incredibly strong. I found this technique helpful using a fine plied cord like this when rolling the bottom of keyhole slits, in necklines for example, as a cord can provide a strong base to secure the hem around. And finally, we see cords and braids used along raw edges to protect them from fraying and wear. Now this can be along a turned raw edge when hemming walls, like the example from the shoulder hem hood, which has a couched cord running along the turned raw edge around the face opening. Cords and braids along raw hems like this can be stitched to the edge before the hem is secured with a whip stitch or blanket stitch, or they can be couched down in place as the hem itself is created. You can learn more about that technique in my hemming part 2 video. Where blanket stitch is used to hem a raw edge, an additional thread or cord can be incorporated and secured as the blanket stitching is done, like this example from Margrethe Hald's book on ancient Danish textiles. You can just see here, that's my little go at it there. Actually provides a really nice effect. And again, note how different the actual piece looks from the stitch diagram. It's another case where things look quite different when they're finished to how they're portrayed in illustrations. It's difficult to tell with some of the examples where we don't have very detailed descriptions if cord was actually attached to a raw edge or to a turned edge. If you've got a heavily filled wall that isn't going to fray, however, attaching your braid directly to that edge is absolutely fine. In this example on a cloak from Evbo Aid, please excuse my pronunciation, it's dreadful, a raw edge is finished with blanket stitch and then tablet braid is attached with whip stitches that catch the edge of the blanket stitch itself rather than the fabric. Now this is migration period, it's slightly before the Viking Age, but it's a lovely example nonetheless. So just to recap, you've got 2 overall categories, the purely functional, which are protective, and the decorative, bearing in mind that a lot of the braids and cords will fall into both. Now when it comes to placement, we've got those 5 broad categories. Protecting the edges of garments or more expensive trims. There's decoration covering construction stitches for hems. Covering darts or other seams, inserted into hems to help shape garments, and finally for protecting and decorating raw edges. Now let's take a closer look at the stitching techniques used to attach them. Okay, so we've had a look at some placement options, but how about attaching the braids to the fabric itself? In most cases, cords and braids are attached using a whip stitch. If you're not familiar with what a whip stitch is, check out this video on the basic Viking Age stitches. That will take you through the basics of the whip stitch technique. A whip stitch has been found attaching cords and braids all over Scandinavia and the UK. We've got examples from York, Hedeby, Birka, Kostrup, Kopang, Dublin, amongst others. Examples from Hedeby, Dublin and Kopang are all attached to the garments using tiny whip stitches, and these measure between 3 and 5 per 10mm section. This is the upper range of stitch spacing that you would want to see on wool and linen garments, and this suggests to me that extra care was taken with these trims. They're making sure to attach them really securely so they can perform their function. We've got a cap from Dublin, which I believe is DHC 33, which uses really long slanting stitches, about 6mm long and 3mm apart, for a decorative effect. But that spacing of stitching is unusual. You usually see lovely, densely, closely worked stitches. A good range to aim for is similar to what you'd use to sew the garment itself, or even more closely spaced. Now the diagonal angle and the spiral profile of a whip stitch make it really good for attaching trims. However, depending on the type of braid or cord that you're using, there's some slight variations in the technique which can work better for particular braids. So we're going to look at those now. When sewing braids edge to edge, the classic whip stitch is perfect for plied or cabled cords and wrapped cords. A series of small, closely spaced, regular stitches encases both cord and fabric edge entirely, firmly securing the braid to the fabric. Using a matching thread, as you can see I've done here, makes the joining stitches almost invisible. Now, here's an example to show you what I mean. You can see along here, you can just about see the joining stitches, but because we're using a matching thread, not very much shows on the right side. And when you move that a little bit further away, you're not really going to see that very much. Now, on this side, you can see the stitches come a little bit further back than they do on the front. You can also see we're using matching threads in different colours. I'm going to show you how that works now. Now, if you're just using a single plain colour, you're not going to need to worry about switching threads, obviously. However, I just wanted to show you quickly what I do when I have got a multicoloured wrapped cord. So we've wrapped this bit, we've left our thread loose. What we're going to do is come back in at the bottom of that stitch and run our needle inside all the way up the turned hem. I'm going to pop it out right on the top. You see there? Coming almost straight up and out. So we're not coming through the front of this, if we can possibly avoid it. We're coming up through the top. So bring that through. Now we're ready to start wrapping this little section of cord and attaching it to the edge. Now, I've already talked about catching this very edge of the right side of the fabric. When we come around the back, we're going to come over the top here and try and match the angle of wrapping as closely as you can, so that this thread pretty much disappears into the wrapped cord itself. And we're going to come in just a few threads back here. We're going to angle our needle again up and out through the top, not down through the front, just up and out through the top there. Come underneath, make sure you're not catching any of the braid with this part of the stitch. Draw your thread through. Now, where we've laid it earlier, it should nicely nestle now in line with the wrapping, so that it disappears once you've pulled your thread tight. I'll show you that again. So we're going to pull over the top, get it as in line as we can. See where it pops over there. Go in there where the thread wanted to lay, and then come out again right at the top here. So this is a whip stitch. It's just a very carefully placed one. Turn over to pull through to make sure it's laying where you want it to. And again, almost invisible whip stitching. Now you're going to carry on in that fashion all the way along, and then you will have whip stitch seam. Now obviously I did these ones a little bit quicker just to get there, but if you take your time with this and keep it really nicely wrapped around, you'll get a lovely neat edge along there. Now the other option with attaching braids edge to edge is for when you've got a flatter style of braid, like this shoulder hem 6-strand or the Hedeby 6-strand, things that don't really lend themselves well to being fully encircled when attaching. So what you can do instead is catch a single loop of the braid, matching the angle of the braid itself on the side closest to the fabric edge, and secure down that part of the braid. On my replica here on the right side, you don't see the stitches almost at all. But turn it over, you can see I've taken a much bigger bite on that side, and you do see the stitches on the inside. This secures it down really, really well. I've got this example here to show you what I mean. Now when we're talking about edge to edge, we're talking about the edge of the braid here and the edge of the fabric here. So you're laying one against the other and then whip stitching along to hold it in place. Now again, if we flip it over, you can see that the stitches on the back come down much further. If you look at this picture of the original here, you can see a close-up of the whip stitching which attaches the braid just here. It's a grey-brown thread. So it catches the edge of the braid and comes a little way onto the tunic as well. So that's quite a visible joining stitch. You can choose to go for that if you want to. If you would like a more invisible finish, you can adapt this technique and do it this way. So on the back of our stitch we're coming down a few threads, and then we're going to come up just as we did with the last one and try and come up exactly at the top here, rather than coming straight through. We're going to just take a bite more to the back of the work. Could have come up at the front. Now we're going to find the part of the braid that this thread wants to sit with to make it most invisible. It looks to me like it wants to go between those two, straight there. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go straight through the braid, and as we pull that tight, you'll see that that thread just almost disappears into there. We flip it over, come out there, take a few threads bite here, making sure we're coming up at the very top, the edge of the fabric there. Pull through and do the same again. I'm going to line that up. That looks like it's going to sit happily there. Pop our needle through. Apologies for the focusing issues we appear to be having today. And tighten it up. And just repeat that to go all the way down to fix your braid exactly where you want it. As you can see, wrapping the entire braid would be less secure in this situation. For more square profile braids like finger loop, you can use a partial catching technique. Whether you're sewing it to an edge or down flat, it's going to be similar either way. I'll just flip this and show you on the wrong side. Once again, you can see we're taking bigger bites on the wrong side of the work, coming up through the top to secure this down. The difference is we're not going all the way over the top with each one. You can choose to do this if you wish, there's nothing wrong with that. If you've got a particularly patterned braid, you may want to use this more partial catching technique as well. So we're going to go in through the very top of the fabric, and we're going to pop out just a few threads down. And then from the back, you're going to come in between 1/2 and 1/3 the way through the braid. Come out right near the bottom there, where you're going to attach to the edge. Pull through. And again, go down into the very edge of the top of the fabric, taking a few threads on the back, bring it through. So we're just partially catching. Now, depending on the width of your braid and the type of material you've used, which edge you want to use is whichever one is going to seem most natural when you start. So don't worry too much about it. If you've got a particular face that you want to come up, then you might want to focus on getting that in place first. But if you haven't, just get started. So when we flip it again, this line here, almost invisible. When attaching braids flat on the top of the fabric, for example when covering a seam or dart, or where you're covering the stitches from a hemline, like in this example here, that's what we're going to do now. For rounded or square profiled cords and braids, you can choose to secure down the entire piece using either whip stitch or couching to cross over the entirety of the braid with each stitch. And this is what I highly recommend for plied, cabled and wrapped cords for sure, as any partial catching technique risks the braid unravelling. So if I show you now, you'll be using a very, very simple stitch, either whip stitch, which will look a bit like this, where you're going across the braid at a diagonal angle, and then back at a diagonal angle again. It's quite a long bite I've taken now, to a little bit smaller for the next one. So you've got a basic whip stitch there, just moving across, back and forth a diagonal fashion. Now, this is absolutely fine for most types of cords and braids. However, you may wish to use a couching technique instead. And I'll show you what that looks like now while we've got our contrasting thread here. You could choose to do it in a matching thread. However, for this one, we'll use this contrasting cord just to illustrate the slight difference from whip stitch. So the difference with a couching stitch is that instead of coming up at an angle over the work, you're going to come directly across. And if I just move this out of the way, when you're coming back in with your needle, you're going to be coming back just a thread width or so across from where you started. Rather than going up and across like this and working in a zigzag fashion, you're going to be making a straight pass over the cord or braid that you're bringing down. You're going to bring that so that it runs horizontally over the cord. Please excuse me fighting with these extra bits of thread for now, so that when you pull it tight, you get a horizontal line. And you come up from behind on the same line almost as you started before, just under the braid. So you're coming up and out at an angle rather than coming straight up at the side of the braid. Straight across again, back in to the hole, almost the hole that you just came out of, so that you're very, very close. At a slight angle again, so that the entry of the stitch is right underneath the middle of the braid. And pull tight. So when you roll it like that, you can see where the stitches enter and exit the fabric is almost invisible because it's entirely covered by the braid. That's quite different to the more rougher diagonal whip stitching. You can bring the entry and exit points of these whip stitches right underneath as well if you want. The techniques are extremely similar, but it will just depend on how angled your braid is, because if you've got a plied cord or a cabled cord with a spiral in it, the whip stitch is going to be your stitch of choice because it will sit in between the spirals of the plied or cabled cord and match much better. But with a wrapped cord, the couching method I find infinitely preferable. For a square profiled braid like finger loop, say you wanted to apply it over these stitches for example, you can use the same whip stitch or couching technique that we just looked at on the wrapped cord. Or you can use the partial catching technique that we used on this braid when we were looking at placing it edge to edge. And in the same way, you can hide the stitches underneath the braid itself if you wish. So each stitch will be coming in and out of the middle of this line of whip stitching. On a turned hem like this, you're using those whip stitches there in the middle as your guides and staying within those. That way, when the braid is finished, you don't see any of the stitching. For flat profile braids, like the shoulder ham and Hedeby 6 strands, when you're laying them flat on a surface, like covering the seam from a dart, you may not want to fully enclose them with whip stitches, as this can spoil the look of the braid. In this case, to stay well secured, they're going to need either 2 rows of whip stitching down either side, matching the angle of the threads, or a whip stitch which alternates between one side and the other as you progress, to ensure both sides are firmly attached. You can see here on the back of this work I've got 2 working threads, because what I'm going to do is I've got 3 colours here, I'm going to follow down a single colour alternating left and right, and then I'm going to follow behind with another one alternating left and right, opposing with the orange. So I'll show you first of all how these stitches work. What we're going to do is we're going to come up right at the top. You see just there, I'm coming up at the top of this dark green, which is the braid that I'm following. So I'm going to come up just there. Then I'm going to take my thread in line with that part of the braid right down into the middle. so that when I pull it through, it'll just happily ease into that part of the braid and you don't see it. And I'm going to move a bit further down. And you can see I'm popping up nicely on the right sort of area there. I'm going to come up just slightly to the side of where that part of the braid starts. And come down through the middle. Again, the stitching disappears. Just keep working your way down like this, alternating which side you pop out. So I did that one just now, so I'm moving to the bottom one here now. If you find that you've come out a little bit lower than you anticipated, it doesn't quite want to sit in the top there, you can just run along the bottom. See whichever one's going to feel right for each little stitch that you do. Now once you've done a few, you can just test that and you can see that there's quite a large gap on each side because you're alternating. So what we're going to do is come in with our orange thread and just do the opposite sides with those ones to close some of those gaps up. So I'm now working in my orange thread. I'm going to have a look. There's a nice gap there. There's a gap here, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3. We're going to close off those areas that are a little bit loose because we're alternating. And these two layers of thread together will hold that braid down really, really securely. And you can choose to either do the whole lot of one colour first of all, or you can choose to alternate, do a little bit and then stop. Entirely up to you. The other option would be to run, if you had less colours probably, would be to run a single thread down one side and then another thread down the other side to make sure both sides are held securely. Because if you only do one side on a flat application, it will wobble about. The same is true for the Head-a-Bee 6-strand braid and all the other 6-strand braids or flat braids that you'll come across. Each pattern will be slightly different, but as long as you just follow along with one little section of the braid, you can get a lovely invisible finish. Remember, these partial catching techniques that we've been talking about are not suitable for plied and cabled cords or wrapped cords because of the spiral nature of the cord. If you're only going through part of it, then you're leaving the uncaught part vulnerable to being caught, torn and the cord unravelling and looking shabby after a while. So with your plied, cabled and wrapped cords, stick to the technique where you're catching the entire thing and leave the partial catching techniques for the other fancier braids. So to sum up, we've got our whip stitches, our absolutely bog standard whip stitches, fantastic for adding plied and cabled cords and wrapped cords along an edge. And we've also got our partial catching technique for edges. This is where we're following the angle of the braid as closely as possible. We flip it over, you can see the stitches are taking a slightly larger bite on the wrong side of the fabric so that they're almost invisible when we come to the outside. When we're working, laying a braid down flat along a piece of fabric, we've got the option to use our whip stitches. You can see those here, they're the slightly angled ones. Or we can use a couching stitch, which gives us this more vertical band over the cord or braid being secured down. Either way, if you work these so that when you're bringing your stitch in, it's right underneath the middle of the braid, and the same when you come out, then you don't get these wide stitches like this. You get these nice, neat, rolled under stitches along there. So for a wrapped cord, it's absolutely up to you which one you want to choose. If you're working with a plied or cabled cord that's got a definite twist, you may want to take advantage of that and use the angled whip stitch instead of the horizontal or vertical angle of a couch stitch, because it will sit nicely inside the twists as you go along. Your other option for working with a flat braid, if it's a more complex braid, is to use these partial catching techniques again, either going opposite sides and then repeating, or just going all the way down one side and all the way down the other side. And we've also got this one here, which is the 5-strand braid. It's a complex form of braid, but it's got a sort of box-like square profile to it. So in this case, you can use either. This is what the partial catching technique ends up looking like on the right side. A bit further down here, that's what it looks like if you just use a basic whip stitch to go all the way over. You could also couch this down if it was along a flat piece of fabric like that. Entirely up to you. Just on the end here, I've just shown you that last option is to use a blanket stitch to secure your braid down. If you've made a really pretty braid, it does obscure most of it. But if you were using a plain one with a contrasting cord for the blanket stitch, that could be a really lovely effect in itself. On the wrong side, you can see we've got more of the raw edge of that fabric there. This is attaching the braid to a raw edge, not a turned edge. It's not going to be quite as secure as using a turned edge, but it's an option. If you want to know a little bit more about couching and about blanket stitch, that hemming part 2 video that I mentioned before will be really useful for you. So there we are. You've now got a variety of options for placing your cords and braids that are evidenced in the archaeological record, and you've also got some ideas of the stitching used to attach them. Now, we haven't talked about using cords and braids, for example, as ties, as we have this very beautifully modelled one here on shoulder hem hood, also a very valid option. And we also didn't talk about using them as ties for the top of tunics, like we have on this one here. Again, another thing you can do. This is an extremely fine whip-corded linen. Works very, very well in these circumstances. Now, as for choosing which one of these options that you're going to go for, that's going to depend a lot on your aims. There's a world of difference between folks trying to recreate a piece exactly, which obviously has a lot more to it than just the types of cords and braids and how they were stitched on, through to somebody wanting a little bit of something to jazz up their reenactment kit for public-facing reenactors, or to strengthen their kit for long-term use, all the way to somebody making a LARP kit or just making braids for fun. If you've got this far and you're just here for fun, yay, well done you. Now, there is no judgment from me on your personal level of authenticity. This channel is here for everybody to learn about this stuff who wants to. I'm a public-facing reenactor with a society that tries to recreate the material culture of the Viking Age as closely as we humanly can. So that's my perspective, that's where I'm coming from. It's why I started the channel, to help other people in a similar situation to me make kit that fit their society's authenticity standards and worked well generally. Now, your society, if you're in one, is going to set a bar for you in terms of authenticity, and it's up to you how much deeper you want to go over that basic level. No judgment here at all. You choose how much more you want to go over that, how deep you want to get into the research and how precise you want to make your recreations. That's up to you. I don't claim to have everything right. I stand on the shoulders of giants in presenting this information to you. The fantastic research that's been done in the past is incredible, and we've got reenactors in the field at the moment doing fantastic work as well. And I give credit to them where it's due. I will also, as far as humanly possible, give you access to my sources as well, or tell you where you can find them. Some of them are out of print now and I've just been able to use snippets, but where I can, I've given you those details, and I encourage you to dig deep into that research and enjoy it, because it's a big part of the hobby. It's part of what we do as historical reenactors, and it's what makes it different from just dressing up and bashing your mates in a field with a sword. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not what we're doing here, and that's not why I'm here to talk to you. So please make use of the references that I put in the bottoms of the videos. Very soon I'm going to be publishing a PDF which contains information and instructions on how to make all of the cords and braids that we've covered so far, except for the shoulder hem belt, because belts are going to have their own little things separately. So look out for that. If you're somebody who prefers to have the information written down in front of you, here for that too. So that'll be coming out soon. Keep an eye out. With all that said, most of us here are going to want to use these cords and braid techniques a little bit more flexibly than simply recreating one single find, and that's why I've kind of laid things out the way that I have. I think that we can take the general principles from the examples we have and use them in a lot of different ways on our kit. You may decide you want to pick a braid style and placement that's found on an extant garment from the area of your persona. I think that's a brilliant way to link your kit to a specific time and place. So a Northern Norwegian character may use the shoulder hem 6-strand braid around the neckline and cuffs of their kit. A person from Hedeby may choose to have a Hedeby 6-strand braid running all the way down the front of their smocker, or they may use a twisted cord around the bottom of their trousers. A character from Burka may want a simple twisted cord running along the top of their smocker, whereas a person from Kopang in Norway may choose to add tablet braid edge to edge first to the top of their smocker and then a cord along the top of that. Or you may choose to apply these principles by region, or just take stuff from all over Scandinavia and the UK at that time to apply to your kit. That's going to depend on what your personal aims are. Now, hopefully in your research you're going to come across additional examples than the ones I've shown here. If there's something that you found that isn't shown here, please let me know. Pop it in the comments or come and find me on the Facebook post for this video or email me. I'm really happy whenever I learn about any new little fragment, so please feel free to share any that I haven't covered here, and please do add links where you can. And the more examples we've got and the more research we've got and the more we discuss it, the better we'll get at what we do. We love links to the sources, oh yes. I really hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into an extremely niche area of Viking Age textile research. If you have, hit like, let me know, and I will make more in the future. I really hope you do, because I love doing these sorts of videos. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and I will see you soon. Bye.